Hello everyone, so welcome to the first video lesson for chapters 3 and 4. So this will be the first video and we're going to be sort of doing chapters 3 to 4 a little differently. So basically in this first video we'll be covering all of the topics relating to the major scales and keys that are introduced in those two chapters, as well as the circle of fifths. And then what we'll be doing for the second video, which we'll be looking at next week, is looking at all of the rhythmic topics that are covered in these two chapters. Okay. Basically we're doing it this way because I thought it would make a little more sense to group the topics that are similar together versus going back and forth between them. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, chapters 3 to 4, the main topic in these is the topic of the major scales and major keys, as well as a very important tool that is often used to become familiar with the major scales and keys called the circle of fifths, which we'll be looking at in just a little while. So basically, what is a scale in music? I'm sure you've probably, even if you're not entirely familiar with it, you've probably at least heard of the term before. So basically, we can define a scale in music as essentially it's just a collection of notes, and typically they follow a logical order. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, basically, with the case of the major scale, each major scale contains 8 notes. Okay, we're looking at our first example here, which is actually the top one is an example of the C major scale. So each one contains 8 notes, and the bottom note and the top note will always be the same letter name. Okay, and going back to that logical order idea, they typically follow the ordering of the lettered musical alphabet. So the C major scale will always start on the note C, and then we'll just go up in orders, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C again. Okay. So what this also means that each major scale will, at the very minimum, contain a range of 1 octave. Okay, so we have to have at least 1 octave to have a full, complete major scale. Okay, and there are, of course, a few different ways to write or construct major scales, but starting out, one of the important things to consider is just the distance between each individual note in the scale. Okay, and to do this, we go back to that idea of whole steps and half steps. Okay, so looking at this image, we can see the distance between each note in terms of whether it's a whole step or a half step, and then we have the abbreviations here. So essentially, we can apply this ordered pattern to any major scale to figure out what all of the notes should be. Okay, so in every major scale, the whole half step pattern will be whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay, and again, we're referring to specifically the distance between the notes. Okay, so we'll use this first scale, C major, as an example. C to D is a whole step. D to E is a whole step. E to F is a half step. F to G is a whole step. G to A is a whole step. A to B is a whole step. And then lastly, B to C is a half step. So we have 2 half steps and then 5 whole steps in each major scale. And then we, of course, can also look at this in terms of the piano keyboard. And this actually brings us to something called a tetrachord. Okay, so in music, a tetrachord is essentially a collection of 4 notes. Okay, that stem of the word tetra, or prefix, you could say. Typically, any word that begins with that prefix tetra, that refers to the idea of 4. Okay, and so in the case of music, it refers to a collection of 4 notes. So in this case, it has the brackets here. It's referring to the tetrachord starting on this D. The first tetrachord contains the notes D, E, it's actually F sharp that it's pointing to here. So D, E, F sharp, and G. And then the second tetrachord starting on A contains notes A, B, C sharp, and D. Okay. So if you just follow what the arrows are pointing to, you can figure out the notes that it's trying to identify here. But the other main thing that it's trying to illustrate, if we look at the whole half-step pattern between each tetrachord, so the first tetrachord has the pattern of whole, whole, half. And then if we just, for a moment, omit this whole step here and look at the second tetrachord, we can see that the second tetrachord also has that same pattern. So basically what we're saying here is that any major scale, you can also think of it along the lines as the first tetrachord has the pattern of whole, whole, half. We have a whole step that separates the 2 tetrachords, and then we repeat that same pattern, whole, whole, half again. Okay. So if you prefer to think of it like that, or if you just want to remember, this pattern here, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, either way is entirely fine. Okay. And then in this example, of course, it's very similar. Now we're just starting, instead of starting on the D, we're back at C again. So this is the illustration of the C major scale on the piano. Okay. Good. And so this brings us now to the circle of fifths. But before we do that, let's actually just try practice constructing a few of these major scales using this whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half step pattern. Okay, so I'm going to give us a starting note here. Let's say I want us to start on the note F. Okay, so I'll give us specifically that F5. So keeping in mind our pattern, if we're starting on the note F, that means we're looking for an F major scale. And we need to use this pattern to figure out what the note should be. So starting on F, a whole step up from F, that should give me the note G. Okay, so I'm starting with the whole step, then I have another whole step up from G, that should give me A. All right, so there I have my whole step. Then I need a half step up from A, which would give me B flat, okay? If you prefer to look at the keyboard, so we're right here, F, G, A, B flat, okay? And then we need a whole step up from B flat, which would give me C. And then it looks like I need another whole step up from C, which would give me D. Another whole step up from D, which would give me an E natural. And then lastly, I need a half step up from E, which would give me F. Okay, so there we have the entire F major scale there. Okay, and this also brings us to another important point. Okay, so thinking back to what we looked at in the last chapter with inharmonic notes. So you might be wondering, let's go back to this example where we were at the A, and I went up a half step up from A, and you might be thinking, well, B flat is also the same as A sharp, so why couldn't I write this as A sharp? Okay, well, there's an important distinction to make here. So another thing to keep in mind with scales is that minus the starting note and the ending note, all of the other notes should not share the same letter name. So for example, again, minus the starting and ending note, which should both start and end on the same letter name, all of the other notes in that scale should not be doubled. So what that means is that I couldn't have an A sharp here because I already have an A natural. If I were to make this an A sharp, that also creates a noticeable gap in between here where we don't have any note on the middle line. And that's also not a desirable thing to have, or rather you shouldn't have it in major scales as well, okay? So technically it's going to sound the same. Okay, if I change that to B flat, it sounds exactly the same. Okay, but the important distinction to note, again, is that in the F major scale, we have B flat, we don't have A sharp. And when we get to the circle of fifths in just a minute here, we'll see why that is a little more clearly, okay? But just to do one more example, let's say we want to do one in the bass clef now, and I'll give us another starting pitch. Let's say I want to start in the note A. So we'll start on this bottom space A here, okay? And I want to figure out what the A major scale is. So I'm going to apply the same pattern. And so again, starting out, I need to have a whole step up from A, which would give me B. And then I need a whole step up from that B, which would give me, let's see, we're at B, that's 1, 2, C sharp, okay? And then I need a half step up from C sharp, which would give me D. And then I need a whole step up from that, which would give me E natural. I need another whole step up from E natural, which would give me 1, 2, that's F sharp. I need another whole step up from F sharp, which would give me 1, 2, G sharp. And then lastly, a half step up from G sharp, which gives me that A that I need to end the scale. Okay. So another thing to keep in mind, going back to the enharmonic idea, if it helps, if you'd like to even, before you figure out the specific exact notes that you'll need in terms of sharps or flats, if it helps to just go ahead and, think, okay, I need an A major scale, so I need an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. So you just write out all of those letters, and then you can go in and add the accidentals as you're figuring out your whole half-step pattern. If it makes it easier to think of it like that. Because again, we can't, for instance, have a D flat here because that, again, gives us a noticeable gap. There's no note on the space here. As well as the fact that now we have two different types of Ds, and in the A major scale, we can only have one type of D, and the A major scale is actually what we call a sharp scale that uses only sharps. It shouldn't use any flatted notes. Okay? So that's why we should use C sharp here. Okay. Good. So let's go ahead and take a look at the circle of fifths now. So you might be familiar with this. You might have even used it some in your previous experiences with music. And this is a very important tool to be familiar with. Okay. So the reason why we call it the circle of fifths is because going in a clockwise fashion, this basically outlines all of the major and minor scales, which we'll get to in one of the later chapters. But for now, we're just focusing on the major scales, which are the red ones on the outer circle here. Okay, so this outlines all of the scales and keys going up by a interval, which we'll also look at in, I believe, chapter 7. By intervals of fifths. So what do I mean by intervals of fifths? Okay, well, let's just look at this here. So let's say we had the note C, okay? If I have a C, we'll actually start in there, C, then I'm going up to G. That is an interval of a fifth because the distance between there, if we start on the C, we have the distance of a fifth there. So if we start counting, the C is 1, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So counting like that, this gives us the interval of a fifth, okay? And we can apply that same thing to basically all of these. So if we're starting on the G, so now if we start on the G, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's G to D. So that's also a fifth. So we have, going up by a fifth, 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 so on and so forth, all around the circle. That's why it's called the circle of fifths. Again, going in clockwise order from right to left, okay? Good, so another thing that this circle of fifths does for us very nicely is not only shows, the idea that we're going up by fifths, but it also shows which scales and keys are what we call the sharp keys and which scales and keys are considered to be flat keys, okay? So looking in this inner darkened circle here, this is what it's telling us. So the information we have for C major, you see just the natural symbol. That tells us that we have no sharps or flats in C major. So, it would be what we call an all white key scale because all of the notes in the scale are natural notes. They don't include sharps or flats, okay? So now as we start going to the right, we'll see that we start to add sharps, okay? So G major, for example, is the major scale that has only one sharp. And then as we go to the right, each scale, or as we go up by a fifth each time, we add one sharp, okay? So G major has one sharp, D major has two sharps, A major has three sharps, so on and so forth. And another interesting thing about this in terms of which notes we add the sharps to, so now if we look at what we call the key signature, so that's how we know which notes are sharped or flatted in any given scale or key. So this tells us, looking at this position here, this in the treble clef is the note F. So we have the sharp written on that top line, that's an F sharp, okay? So what that means is that in the key of G major, F sharp is our one sharp. In the key of D major, we have two sharps and they go in the specific order of F sharp to C sharp, okay? And remembering that this is called the circle of fifths, what you'll find is that the order of sharps actually, like the circle of fifths goes up by fifths, the order of sharps also goes up by fifths. So let's take a look at what we might mean by that. Well, if we start on F sharp, so I'll just start here, and we go to our next key, now we have F sharp and C sharp. Okay. So if I track that distance between F sharp and C sharp, F sharp would be 1, then the G would be 2, A would be 3, B would be 4, C sharp would be 5. Okay, so we have a fifth between F sharp and C sharp, so that's also going up by fifths in the order of sharps in each key signature, okay? Likewise, if we continue doing that, so we have F to C sharp, A major, now we can go up another fifth when we add the third sharp, we go C sharp to G sharp, that's up a fifth. E major, G sharp to D sharp up a fifth. B major, D sharp to A sharp up a fifth, and so on and so forth, okay? And it's also very important to note the specific position of where each sharp is written, and this also applies to the flats when we get to the flat keys here in just a moment, okay? So noting that in all of the major sharp keys, really basically any keys, so minor as well, but so S sharp should always be written on the top line. C sharp should always be written on that third space there. G sharp should always be written on that space above the staff, so on and so forth. So if you're not familiar with that, I would suggest go ahead and just becoming really familiar with it, memorizing it, whatever you need to do to know where each accidental should be written specifically, okay? So there we have the sharp keys. And like I said, they go around in a clockwise fashion from right to left. But you'll notice that the other part of the circle of fifths we have here, of course, are the flatted keys. So going from now counterclockwise, left to right, this is what gives us the flatted keys. And the flat keys are essentially the opposite of the sharp ones, in that the sharp keys ascend by fifths, while the flatted keys descend by fifths. Okay, so let's take a look at that here. So if I have, starting over, let's say I just want to start at C again, okay? So if I'm starting at C, but now I'm going down by a fifth, so now I'm going down B, A, G, F, which is my next key here. So I'm counting C as 1, so this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is still the distance of a fifth. So now we're descending instead of going up, we're descending going down, going to the left by fifths, okay? And the other thing that correlates here, going back to the key signatures in terms of how we have the accidentals, remember that when we had the sharps, we were adding sharps by fifths, you know, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp. With the flat keys, we're adding flats by descending, just like when we're going from left to right on the actual circle. So what I mean by that is, we look at our first accidental, so in F major, the one flat we have is E flat, okay, on that middle line. And the next key, B flat, so now we have B flat and E flat. So if we start on the B here and go down by a fifth, this would be B is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which would give me that E flat. Okay, so there we have the distance of a fifth, B flat going down to E flat, and then we of course can apply the same concept as we continue along. So we're at E flat, now we're going down another one to A flat, descending another fifth in the key of A flat major to D flat, so on and so forth. Okay. And another thing I wanted to mention here, let's say if you're having sort of an opposite approach where you're given a key signature and you want to be able to recognize what key it is just by looking at the key signature. Well, there's a little sort of trick or tool to do that. And for the sharp keys, the way to do that is you can look at whatever the very last sharp is. So let's, for example, let's look at E major here. The very last sharp of E major is D major, or I'm sorry, D sharp, okay? If we go up a half step from D sharp, that gives us what the key will be. So I go up a half step from D sharp and I get one key, E natural, okay? And that's what the key is. If I'm in A major, let's say we don't actually know this is A major, but you can see that it's a key that has 3 sharps, and you think it's a major key, we can look at the very last sharp, G sharp, go up a half step, and you get A, okay? So you can apply that to any of the sharp keys. Now for the flat keys, it's a little different, but there's still a tool that you can use. The way to recognize a flat key without knowing what it is, so we look at, for example, let's say E flat major. You look at the very last flat and you just go back 1 flat, and that will give you what the key is, okay? So E flat major, my last flat is A flat. I go back 1 flat and I get E flat major, okay? Let's say I see a key with 5 flats. My very last flat is G flat, okay? I go back 1 and that gives me D flat. That's what my key is, okay? So I would certainly recommend, trying to remember that. It really helps when you're starting out recognizing keys. until you, of course, get to the point where you just don't need any tools like that. You just know, A major is three sharps, F sharp, C sharp, D sharp. A flat major is four flats, B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, so on and so forth. Okay. So there we have the circle of fifths. And just to keep in mind that, of course, this particular version of the circle of fifths showed everything in the treble clef. This essentially would all apply to the bass clef as well. The only difference is basically everything is shifted down two positions because it has to reflect where the notes are in the bass clef. So just to give you a really brief example of that, let's say um, I want a key signature, let's say A major. So notice the comparison here of bass clef to treble clef. Bass clef, F sharp is on that fourth line, C sharp is on the second space, G sharp is on the top space, and compared to treble clef, it's, of course, like I said, everything is basically two positions lower. Okay. Good. So a few other things we have here. This is just an image showing all of the scales written out. And I believe, I forget what pages exactly, but in your textbook in chapters 3 or 4, somewhere in there, there is an image very similar to this. But the eventual goal is to not to have to rely on all the scales written out to know what they are. But I just wanted to include this here so you can actually see what they look like all written out. Okay. But in the homework for these chapters, you will actually have some exercises where you have to write out and construct the scales as you're on your own. And I would expect that you wouldn't actually have to rely on this to do that. Okay. So a few other things relating to scales. So we have something called scale degrees. We have something called solfege, and we have something called scale degree terms or scale degree terminology. Okay. So scale degrees, these are basically numbers that we apply to each step or each degree of the scale. And you usually see like this little small caret symbol written above the number. In music, anytime you see a number with a caret symbol like that written above it, it's basically implying that it's referring to a scale degree. So if you see like the number 3 with that symbol over it, it means scale degree 3. Okay. And basically, the way that we understand scale degrees, so for example, scale degree 3 refers to the third note in that scale, starting from scale degree 1. So in this case, it looks like we have a D major scale because we're starting on D and ending on D. And D major, of course, is our major scale with two sharps, F sharp and C sharp. And each of these scale degrees is referring to a specific note in the scale. So D is scale degree 1, E is scale degree 2, F is scale degree 3, so on and so forth. The only sort of important, or I should say slightly more important thing to note here is that the scale degree, once you get to the top note that's repeated in terms of the letter name, it can either be referred to as scale degree 1, if we start rewriting the scale an octave higher, or it could be referred to as scale degree 8 because it's an octave higher than the note we started with. Okay. So either one of those would be correct. D is, technically, it is scale degree 1 and 8, depending on how you're thinking about it. So if you were to come across that in an assignment, either one of those can be used correctly. Okay. And then we have something called solfege. If you're perhaps a vocalist, you might have been familiar with this. Solfege, basically, this is usually used more so in a singing context. You'll certainly use this whenever you get into your musicianship courses, when you do things like sight singing, things like that. But solfege can directly correlate to the scale degrees, and we have what we call a solfege syllable for each scale degree in the scale. So scale degree 1 is known as Do, Scale degree 2 is known as re. Scale degree 3 is known as mi. Scale degree 4 is known as fa. Scale degree 5 is known as so. Scale degree 6, la. Scale degree 7, ti. And then when we get back to scale degree 1 or 8, we just start with do again. Okay. Perhaps you know really old musical, if you know the Sound of Music. I remember when I was in school and for our music classes, was sort of ingrained in us very forcefully. So I certainly remember, you know, all of the do, re, mi, fa, so segments in there, if you're familiar with that. Okay, so there we have solfege. And then the other thing here, scale degree terms or scale degree terminology. So this is also important. So, and these also directly correlate to scale degrees and solfege. So scale degree 1, I'm using the Roman numerals here, is known as the tonic. Okay, so that's the tonic, it's do, scale degree 1. Scale degree 2, re, in terms of the term we use for that, we would say it's the supertonic. Scale degree 3, we call the mediant. Scale degree 4, we call the subdominant. Scale degree 5, we call the dominant. Scale degree 6, we call the submediant. Scale degree 7, we call the leading tone. And lastly, when we get back to the starting note, the top note of the scale, it's the tonic again, okay? So if we're looking at the reason or the etymology behind these terms, you might notice a few patterns here. So, for example, looking at the dominant in the scale. So in the case of C major, the dominant scale degree 5 is G. If we compare that to the subdominant, the prefix of subdominant, of course, is sub, which typically, you know, if you think of any word that has that in there, like submarine or what's another example, like substandards or anything like that, typically means below. Okay, if it's below or lower than something. So in the case of the subdominant, it's basically telling us this is below or lower than the dominant. Okay, hence subdominant. Likewise, submediant, this is a little trickier, but the idea is that it's basically, if we think about what the term mediant means, it's basically anytime we see that term mediant in music, it usually refers to the idea of it being in the middle, or more specifically like a third, okay? And if we think of the idea of a third here, submediant is basically implying that it's a below the tonic by a median. So it's a third below the tonic, okay? And likewise, mediant in relation to the tonic is a third above, okay? So mediant, third above the tonic, submediant, third below the tonic, okay? And so what about the other ones here? Well, supertonic, if we think about, you know, something is super, you know, it basically means it's the opposite of sub, it's higher than above. And so supertonic is above the tonic, okay? You can see that relation there. And the only other one, leading tone, the easiest way to think of this, I think, is that it basically leads into the tonic, okay? So if I had, let's say, a major scale and we want to listen without leading tone, okay, so I just play the C major scale right there. The B is our leading tone. Because it really leads back into the higher C. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay, and that's why we call it the leading tone, because it really wants to push, you know, gives that forward momentum leading into the tonic. Okay, so there we have our scale degree terminologies, solfege, and scale degrees. Okay, and you will, in your homework for this part of chapters 3 to 4, you'll have sort of a mixture of exercises, but one of them will be where you'll have to You'll either be given a note, and you'll have to identify, say the solfege, the scale degree, or the scale degree term when you're given a particular note in a particular scale or key. Or you might be given the opposite, where you're given information like A major, what is re in A major, okay? So yeah, just some exercises to keep in mind with that. And actually, not to make this too long, but actually let's try a few examples there. So let's say, I'll give us a new key signature, let's say B flat major. And we saw in B flat major the note G, okay? And I want to identify the scale degree, the solfege, and the scale degree terminology for the note G in B flat major, okay, which of course has two flats, B flat and E flat. So first of all, thinking about what the tonic is, okay, so B flat major, the tonic scale degree 1 is B flat, and then I can approach it a few different ways. Either you can think of it along the lines of, if you want to just write out the scale and figure out what the scale degree is here, or if you want to think of it along the lines of just, thinking about the letter names. So for example, B flat, and I go in order, B flat, not thinking about, really accidental, just the letter name. So B flat, C, D, E, F, G, that brings me to 6, okay? And what that would tell me is that G is the 6th scale degree in B flat major, okay? And so if it's scale degree 6, that means the solfege would be La, and that also means that the terminology for that would be the submedian. So this would be, let's see here, I want to actually label this. So scale degree 6, I don't actually have the, can't really write this since it's not handwritten properly, but we said scale degree 6, the solfege would be La, and then we could also say it would be the submediant. Okay, something like that. So there we have it. What if we did the opposite? So let's say I have, let me give us a new key signature. And I want us to have a key signature with 4 sharps. And I want to know what is scale degree 3 in this key with 4 sharps, assuming that it's a major key because we haven't covered the other main type minor keys yet. So all of these, it's implied that they're all major, okay? So first we need to figure out what our key is here. So we can, of course, do this a few different ways. If you want to do it with the little tool I suggested, so looking at with sharp keys, the very last sharp and going up a half step. So regardless of whether you look in the treble or bass clef, we can see that the last sharp is the D sharp. If I go up a half step, that gives me E natural, and that gives me the key. So this is E major, okay? And in E major, what would scale degree 3 be? Well, if E is scale degree 1, the tonic, scale degree 2 would be some type of F, scale degree 3 would be some type of G, okay? And then I can specifically think in terms of the key signature, because if I have to write out a G here, the key signature already tells us that it's not G natural, but G sharp, okay? So that's what the purpose of a key signature is. It tells us, unless you see an accidental written directly next to the note to the left, it's implied that it's G sharp because that's in the key signature, okay? So there we have scale degree 3, and that also means that G sharp would be In terms of solfege, that would be mi. And then in terms of our terminology, that would be the mediant. Okay. So there we have that. All right. Let's see. I think that was everything. So I will be uploading a few listening examples so you can have some discussion for this week on, getting a little more familiar with listening for major and major scales and keys from that perspective. And then I'll also post the specific information for the homework assignment by the time this video becomes available, okay? But yeah, I think that was everything. So as always, if you have any questions or if anything was unclear, please feel free to let me know. But if not, I will see you next time.